The film introduction contains several photographs of President Kennedy and President Johnson, addressing crowds, meeting with key leaders, and at work in their offices.
Hello, and welcome
A uniformed
to the
park
JFK
ranger appears in front of a
and
visual
LBJ,
background of
the
student
New
protesters.
Frontier in the Great Society special webisode series. During these webisodes, we will be comparing JFK and LBJ and examining them from a human perspective. Today, we will focus on 2 congressmen and 2 senators, the legislative years. Today, we have Park Ranger Jonathan Streff from the John Fitzgerald Kennedy National Historic Site and Park Ranger Joseph Owen from the Lyndon Baines Johnson National Historical Park. I am Joy Kinard, and I'm the superintendent of the Central Alabama Civil Rights Sites. Hey, Jonathan.
Hey, Joy. How are you?
Good, and you?
Well, thanks.
Hey, Joseph.
Hi, Joy.
How are you?
Nice to be here.
Good.
Doing good.
So let's jump right into our discussion about legacy because our audience wants to know, and we've got to keep inquiring minds knowing. My first question is, what led these men to become involved in politics?
All right, Joy, it's great to be here again. We'll jump right in. So, Jack
A uniformed
Kennedy,
park
after
ranger
World
in front of
War
a
II,
visual
is
background of
unsure
JFK's
of what he
birthplace,
wants to do.
a
He's
gray,
thinking about becoming a
3-story
journalist.
house with
He's
dark
thinking about
green
going to graduate
shutters.
school, maybe becoming a lawyer. He's got 2 grandfathers who were involved in politics, and obviously his father was as well. The typical narrative when you talk about Jack Kennedy is that because of the death of his older brother, he was pushed towards running for politics. And there's some truth to that in the sense that his father is putting some pressure on him. But the fact of the matter is, Jack Kennedy, after World War II, that was our last episode, decides that he wants to engage in public service. So he's going to run for the 11th congressional district seat, which incorporates portions of Somerville, Charlestown, the North End. And these are areas that he would not have spent a lot of time in. So he's going to have the help from his grandfather, John Francis Fitzgerald, who was a member of Congress and also the mayor of Boston, and his mother, Rose Fitzgerald. So it's that first run for Congress. And people weren't sure what to make of this skinny rich kid, because that's what they called him. He's coming back from the service. He's in bad shape. In Boston, we have the Bunker Hill Day Parade on June 17th, which is always warm here in June. And again, this kid is suffering from malaria, but he's campaigning in the primary. So he marches this 5-mile parade up a lot of different hills. At the end of the parade, he ends up collapsing, but he ends up going on to win a victory and goes on. This skinny rich kid goes on to
a black and white photo of young JFK with his maternal grandparents at a voting
Congress,
station.
Because of his commitment to public service.
Wow. Thank you, Jonathan. Joseph?
That's an easy question to answer. His father, Samuel Lee
A
Johnson
uniformed
Jr.,
park ranger sits in front of a blue-gray background with a wooden door and hanging picture frames.
Sam Ely Johnson Jr. was a powerful Texas state senator. He was well known, he was well liked, well trusted. When Lyndon Johnson was 13, his father Sam was a Democratic senator representing Blanco County. He would take Lyndon Johnson up there to the state capitol in Austin and have him listen to the legislative process. At the home life, Samuel Lee Johnson would bring over his friends there and debate at the kitchen dining room table the current politics of Texas. Lyndon Johnson was an apt listener. He would absorb what his father and his friends were saying. And so when Lyndon Johnson was running for the House of Representatives in 1937, he was there at the front porch of his home. He
1937 campaign poster.
Samuel Lee Johnson Jr., the former Texas congressman, his mother, and Lady Bird Johnson. And it was lessons learned from Lyndon Johnson about how to be politically savvy, how to go on the campaign trail. Samuel Lee Johnson Jr. would take his son on the campaign trail to little towns in Texas. Lyndon Johnson said it was some of the best experiences of his life. As a matter of fact, at the Lyndon Johnson National Historical Park Visitor Center in Johnson City, we have a Model T Ford, a replica of Samuel Lee Johnson Jr.'s Model T 1916 Ford that was given by Henry Ford II, a replica of it to Lyndon Johnson, because he had such good memories of going on the campaign trail with his father. So definitely it was Samuel Lee Johnson Jr. that led him to the path to run for the House of Representatives. Lyndon Johnson never did run for Texas governor or even a Texas state senator. He went federal right away.
Wow, that is fascinating. Okay, the next question is, who was the better legislator or politician?
Yeah, so I'll start there, and I think
okay.
Joe will probably agree with me. I think Lyndon Johnson's the better legislator, no question about that. And we'll talk more. I'll have Joe talk more about that in a moment. From a political standpoint, though, I think they were both equals in many respects, and had sort of different skill set. But as Joe talked about, I think what's interesting to connect here is that you have family members who are influencing the style. And again, I think, Lyndon Johnson's going to take elements of his father's style, but also go in different directions. Jack Kennedy's going to take elements of his grandfather's style, his mother's style, and go in different directions as well. As we've talked about before, Jack Kennedy's health is really going to impact his ability to be a kind of effective legislator. He does sign on to pieces of legislation when he's in the House that deal with housing for veterans, that deal with labor issues as well. But he gets bored in the House, and he decides to run for the United States Senate in 1952. Now, what's interesting, and this connects with your politician question, is that Jack Kennedy is recognizing that people know who he is in the Boston area, but they don't know him across the state. And so sort of similar to what LBJ is going to have to deal with when he's making that transition from his congressional district to the state. Now, obviously, Texas is significantly bigger, so there's more on LBJ's plate than Jack Kennedy can drive across the state here in 2.5 hours, while LBJ has to get
a black and white photo of LBJ in 1948,
right?
waving his hat in front of his campaign helicopter, which
Jack
has
Kennedy
Lyndon Johnson painted on the tail.
That in 52, he's going up against an incumbent. You've got the Republicans in control of both the White House and the House and the Senate. And so he decides to start mobilizing voters who have not come out before. And so he and Polly Fitzgerald, his cousin, decide to go after female voters in Massachusetts. And they're going to receive personalized invitations.
Black and white photo of Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy speaking on stage at a campaign tea in 1952, with viewers including JFK, Eunice, and Jean Kennedy seated behind her.
Of their socioeconomic status, irregardless of whether they're white or black, who are being invited to these events. It doesn't cost them any money at all. They can have tea and coffee and then literally meet Jack Kennedy, who's running for Congress. So not only is he doing that, but he's also going into the black community. Now, if he's not there, he'll send out surrogates as well. But talking about civil rights issues, and as we'll talk about a little bit later on, Jack Kennedy is a little bit tepid on civil rights. He's going to come to that a little bit later on, but he's recognizing that there are voters out there that folks are not talking to. And if you want to get someplace, you have to have people who are going to vote for you. So in 52, it's women and African Americans who are going to put him over the top. And he will follow that exact same pattern when he runs for president in 1960. And we'll talk about this a little bit later on, but in 1960, ahead of Johnson, he's going to send out people to every single state and begin to go, he'll look for the up and comers, he'll look for the young people, and he's going to try to get up the delegate count so when the convention comes around, he has their votes. What the Johnson people will discover when they arrive in places like Wyoming is that Bobby Kennedy or another Kennedy has already gotten there, and they already got those folks in the door. Not to mention the fact, too, we've talked about kind of voting, but Jack Kennedy is not born as a very polished speaker. That comes over time. He has kind of a nasally voice at first. He has to work very hard. But once he is able to get his thoughts down on paper, but then simultaneously capture an audience, there'll be a sense of energy and momentum that he's going to bring to the campaign trail, much like LBJ is. Both of them campaigned to the point where they would run themselves into the ground. LBJ is going to have an appendectomy, has a heart attack. Jack Kennedy, of course, has the health issues. But folks are astonished that this skinny kid in 46 and in 52 just keeps going. Will travel all over the place despite whatever illness he has. So not a great legislator, but I would argue a master politician. And he oftentimes is not given credit for that. Folks oftentimes assume it's other people in the room who are doing it, but he's kind of doing it on the DL, as the kids will say. He's kind of doing it quietly.
I love it.
He's doing sort of behind the scenes thing and is a little bit more detached from stuff, but he knows who to talk to. He knows who to get out. But I think probably the most important thing about his political skills in both the House and the Senate is mobilizing voters and getting folks out.
Wow, that is phenomenal. Thank you, Jonathan. Joseph?
Well, in my opinion, Lyndon Johnson was the best United States Senator we've ever had and will ever have. This man knew Congress like the back of his hand. When he was elected to the House of Representatives in 1937, he made it a point to know the most influential members of Congress in both houses, Senate and Representatives. It didn't matter if you were a Republican. It didn't matter if you were a Democrat. If you were powerful and could help him, he wanted to get to know you. He would become your best friend. He would take you out to ball games. He would take you out to dinner, and he wanted to know you. And he wanted to know what you. He wanted to know the thinking of these influential members. It didn't matter how he got it. He wanted to know, because he knew later on that he could get these men on his side to get legislation passed. Now, he learned a hard lesson when in 1937, of course, he won the House of Representatives. And right after he left naval service in 1942, he was running for Congress again against Pappy O'Daniel, a good Pappy O'Daniel was a former governor, and he was known as Pass the Biscuits Pappy. Pappy would go on to country music stations, and he would talk about your good old country music, and he'd always say, "Pass the biscuits." And so he knew how to get people laughing and really be comfortable with them. And Lyndon Johnson learned a hard lesson. He learned that because he lost, he hated to lose. Lyndon Johnson hated to lose. And so he made sure that would never happen again. So when he was running in 1948, he's running against a good man named Coke Stevenson, who was a former governor of Texas. And there's a little bit of controversy about how Lyndon Johnson was able to beat Coke Stevenson. They called him Landslide Johnson because Lyndon Johnson said, I'll beat Coke Stevenson by a landslide. He only beat Coke Stevenson by 87 votes. And so they called LBJ Landslide Johnson for the rest of his life. But let me tell you something. Lyndon Johnson had a great mentor in Congress.
Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn.
Longest serving Speaker of the House over 30 years. He showed Lyndon Johnson the back rooms of Washington, D.C., how to get things done behind the scenes. And so Lyndon Johnson became very politically savvy. There's two men in his life who taught him that: his father, Samuel Lee Johnson Jr., and Sam Rayburn. And Lyndon Johnson was part of these very influential committees. He was part of the Senate Appropriations Committee, Armed Forces Committee. And Lyndon Johnson, if you went up against him and if you were part of a committee and you had to testify in front of him, you better make sure you know your stuff, because he would know it. Even if he would agree with you privately, he would try to get the opposite side of what the person was going to debate him about in the committee. It didn't matter what it was. You know, if you took one side, he'd say, well, I don't agree with that there. I want you to tell me some more about this and why you think it should pass. And he'd be with you all the way, but he would never tell you this. Lyndon Johnson had some powerful friends all the way through Congress. One thing he didn't do, though, he never really talked about civil rights very much. Like I said in previous episodes, he was politically savvy enough that if he started to speak out for civil rights, he'd be a one-term congressman. He would be. So it was a big, big shock for the Dixiecrats, or the Southern senators and representatives, when he became vice president and president, giving bold statements about civil rights, getting civil rights.
January 18th, 1964,
passed.
President Lyndon B. Johnson meets with civil rights leaders.
Biggest Dixiecrats in Congress, that is Senator Richard Russell from Georgia. And
December 7th, 1963, President Lyndon B. Johnson meets Senator Richard Russell.
So when it came for the Civil Rights Bill being passed, Richard Russell was very angry. And he told Lyndon Johnson, he goes, I'm going to filibuster the Civil Rights Bill, and it will never go on the Congress floor. It will never get voted upon. And Lyndon Johnson, like I said in previous episodes, said, Dick, I love you like a brother. And we've been going through the campaigns together, and we were in Congress over World War II together. But let me tell you, if you get this bill filibustered, I'm going to get you, and I'm going to run over you. And so don't try to do it. Well, as we all know, it was like two bulls in a arena. And it was a tough, Lyndon Johnson didn't think for a little while that Civil Rights Bill would be going to Congress to a vote because of filibuster. But he was able to get enough senators on his side. And it was because he knew these senators. He knew what they liked and what they disliked. Even if he disagreed with them, he would never tell them. And so Lyndon Johnson was savvy. Why? Because he knew how Congress worked. And he knew Washington, D.C. like the back of his hand. And so he was, to me, the best senator we've ever had in the United States history, and probably will ever have.
Wow. Thank you so much, Joseph, for those comments. So our last question is, what skill sets did these men bring to the table? Jonathan?
Yeah, Joe, I think you pretty much answered that question. I kind of did a little bit already, but just to kind of piggyback a little bit, I think you've got LBJ, again, who has a very big personality, right? He comes into a room and, Joe, as you've talked about before, he gets that from his dad, right? He will go in, and I like how you sort of talked about the fact that he will listen. He's trying to find out who these people are and what's going on. Jack Kennedy will listen too, but you won't know that he's listening. He'll just be off in the corner sort of observing what's going on. Campaigning didn't come natural to him. He was kind of a shy and reserved guy. And so, he'd come in and sort of shake hands, and it took a little while for him to kind of get going. And so this is where he would make connections with folks that knew what needed to happen. The other thing I think too that's going to be happening for JFK in the Senate is that by the time we get to about 1956, not unlike Johnson, he has his eyes on the presidency, right? Johnson keeps talking about it, but also at the same time doesn't want it. He doesn't want to fail, as we talked about before. His biggest fear is that he'll be like his father in terms of failing, although we could argue that his father was quite successful in many respects. But so again, Jack Kennedy, and so he'll write a book called Profiles in Courage, sort of focusing on 8 U.S. senators who at different points took principled stands. And I would argue this is JFK trying to kind of figure out who he is and compare himself to some of these historical figures, because there are moments in the Senate where there isn't courage. He doesn't stand up for civil rights for the same reason that Joe was talking about before. He is terrified of losing Southern Democrats if he decides to go for nationwide office. Eleanor Roosevelt at one point said something to the effect of, Jack Kennedy is showing a lot of profile, but not a lot of courage. So there's definitely some pushback. But I think the skill sets that he's bringing to the table, as we talked about just a few moments ago, is his ability to read a room, to be able to read people, to listen, and also connect with folks as well.
Joseph?
Yes, ma'am. The final thing about Lyndon Johnson's legislative years is all this leads to him wanting to be president. Like Jonathan said, his ambition was to be president. I believe he thought he was going to get the 1960 presidential nomination from the Democratic Party. But around 1958, he sees this young senator from Massachusetts on his radar. And this young senator is John F. Kennedy. And he didn't really know how to take John F. Kennedy because he was a popular young senator from Massachusetts. And so in 1960, when John Kennedy got the Democratic nomination, Lyndon Johnson was crushed. Lyndon Johnson did not take defeat well. He really thought he was going to go back to Texas and just live out the life on the ranch. He said, I'm done. I'm done with politics. I'm not going to get involved in this anymore. I thought I was going to be president, but I'm not going to be, so I'm just going to go back to Texas. Well, when Jack Kennedy asked Lyndon Johnson to be vice president, he was surprised. He really was. And he said, yes, I'll go ahead and I'll do that. And I don't think it was his ambition to take over from John Kennedy. Of course, he became president tragically. However, I think he just wanted to be a vice president. It's better than going
November
back to
16th
Texas
or 17th, 1960, Senator John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson at the LBJ Ranch.
He had enough senators and enough power in the United States to not worry about it. But in 1958, things started to change. And that was because of his future boss, President Kennedy.
Wow, this has been such a great discussion. We are out of time, guys. Can you believe it? I know it's just gone by so quickly. I just wanted to let everyone know, join us for the next episode on the presidency of JFK. I can't wait for that discussion. Thank you so much for joining us today. Take care.
Credit slides of white text on a black background roll, identifying and thanking those who appeared in the video and those who helped edit and produce the video series.